Yeah, we'll get started at 5 after. We're almost there. Welcome again to folks who just joined us. I'm going to put in the chat again, we have a resource on our website, agrariantrust.org, where we're collecting the webinars, the recordings. So if there are folks that wanted to be here and missed one of the sessions, we'll have a whole playlist up of all of the past sessions and a lot of resources too. But thanks for joining us, everyone, and I'll pass it on to Katie if you would like to say a few opening remarks.
Oh, sure.
Gary's here too.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here today. I hope you enjoyed a long weekend, and we're happy to be back and to welcome Fran and Kristin back to this group, and welcome them for the first time for those of you who are new in joining us. Jean is going to give a little bit more of an intro, and so I think I'm going to go ahead and bop it back over to her.
Well, thank you. And welcome again, everyone. And I love that. I second that notion. Please, say who you are and where you're coming from or any organizational affiliations. Just drop that in the chat when you have a second, because we'd love to know where you're calling in from. I'm Jean Willoughby. I'm working with the leadership of Agrarian Trust and serving in an executive role. Just really working involved with a lot of different community-based land stewardship efforts. And so we're really pleased to be in this collaboration with the collaborative or the collective models for land access working group. And a couple months back, we invited Fran Miller, who's a board member at Agrarian Trust, to come and speak about some of her work in Vermont with the is it White River Land Collective? And so that was wonderful. And Kristin has also come and spoken with us before. She's an attorney, as is Fran. And Kristin King-Ries is with us, and she is just an expert on things related to community land trusts and is going to highlight the differences for us between community land trusts and conservation trusts, as well as answer some questions that you all may have about different legal entities. And so we had a really insightful discussion last time around. And again, I'll share that link for those who just joined. We were discussing equitable land access, equitable access to ownership, legal tools for creating and maintaining affordability was one of our previous talks. And so we're going to pick up on some of those same themes here, and we'll be looking at the legal entity comparison chart that Fran and Kristin put together for us. And we hope that you all had a chance to at least look at that. And I would love to also invite folks to, in the chat, you can send your questions to Katie or myself, and we'll collect questions to share with the speakers, and we'll kind of try to order them. And if there's multiple that kind of have the same theme, we might combine a few questions, but feel free at this point to just send us, private chat, myself or Katie, just any questions you might have about legal entities so we can start collecting those for the session today. And so can I hand it off to you, Fran?
Sure. Thanks, Jean. Hi, everybody. Happy Tuesday after a long weekend. I'm Fran Miller, and I work at the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law and Graduate School. And there I work on a host of kind of food and agriculture policy issues, including from stemming land loss and working on heirs property issues to land access for young and beginning and historically marginalized folks. And that work for me involves a lot of work on commons projects. And it's really in that context that I began working with Agrarian Trust, really when I first started at CAFS almost 5 years ago. And I wanted to open here with a little bit about our learnings, especially over the last year. So Agrarian Trust really started, or at least at some point started, talking about the model. And the model that Agrarian Trust developed was this model where there was a parent organization of a community land trust, and then a whole bunch of local projects that were connected to the national. And the legal terms for this were a 501c3 parent and a 501c2 local organization. And what we discovered in really diving into this over the last year or two, and the we is really a broad we, Kristin and Jean, and I see Nathan and Sarah are on here who are Agrarian Trust staff, and through a lot of work with our local projects that had gotten developed, is that there really is not a model. What really matters is what y'all are doing on the local level. And as a lawyer friend of mine once told me, don't even start talking about legal model until you find out what people are doing. What you're actually doing is what really matters. So that C3, C2 model could work, perhaps, where there's a property, a land, a piece of land, a parcel, and multiple farmers are farming on it, and they're not interested in doing educational activities or what some people might call charitable activities, what the IRS would call charitable activities, other things. They're really just, they want to focus on farming, and that's what they're doing. And the local autonomy, local control isn't really at issue. They care about decommodifying the land, taking the land off the market. They care about good ecological practices. They care about producing food for the local community. And that's the container. So in that case, it might be that the national organization having a lot of control over that local project doesn't matter so much. But for many of the local projects that Agrarian Trust actually helped support to develop, local control is a really important piece of it. Local autonomy is a really important piece of it. People are doing all kinds of really interesting and varied activities on the land, bringing kids in, or just like a lot of education and other kinds of activities. And so there, that C3, C2 model doesn't work, because a local C2 can only be a landholding entity. It cannot engage in charitable activity. It cannot do anything more than just hold the land. And so I really wanted to stress this, because it feels like such an important learning that, and in a way, as I say this, it feels so obvious, but one model doesn't fit all, but really, it really doesn't. And it's just so important to really work out the things that you all are actually doing and actually wanting to do in your local projects. And then the lawyers can come in and offer some expertise around what might work. And the other part of this is that we're all trying to do new things. And so, as Jean said in the intro she wrote for the chart, the law is written for private property, capitalists, folks who are just, really trying to make money. And a lot of people, especially on this call and in other places, that's not their major goal. And so the legal structures that we're using to fit these local projects, it's a little bit a circle in a square peg, or a square in a circle peg, whatever that metaphor is. They don't quite fit. So we are learning alongside y'all. And I just also wanted to make that point. We have some expertise to offer, but y'all are experts in what you're doing. And so we really are working together here to figure this all out. And the folks here and on this call are like one subset of a lot of people across the country who are trying to do these things. So you are not alone. We are not alone. And I just really wanted to put that in perspective. And I guess one final piece is I am working on this local project here in Vermont called the White River Land Collaborative. And I spoke about it, I guess it was a couple months ago. And that project also has just really taught me, we went into it with one idea of what was going to work legally. Being the lawyer, I'm like, oh yeah, this is what we should do. And then we got into it and saw the conservation easement and got the farmer on the land, and now it's all, different. So things changed. And as the projects develop and as you actually get on the land and start working, it also changes what is going to happen. So some flexibility there is required too. That's my my 3 cents, Jean. Thank you for giving me that opportunity.
Thanks, Fran. And so we have collected a couple of questions so far. I'm scrolling back through, and I did want to invite Kristin, if you wanted to add anything onto that. You've been working with Agrarian Trust, and we're so grateful for all your insights as well. And I thought maybe you could give a little bit of an overview of some of your work and perspective, and even touch on some of the differences between the major options so that folks can kind of start to generate some questions.
Sure. Hi. Yes, so I've had the good fortune of working with Agrarian Trust on a bunch of projects, and but I came to this work initially through community land trusts, and focusing on affordable home ownership, where the community owns the land and then homeowners own the homes, and it's a way of sort of trying to share equity, share money that we make from our homes between ourselves and our communities. And when I first started doing this work for Agrarian Trust, that felt it was kind of in a different place from where the agrarian commonses were. And the more work we do, the more my work kind of all starts to overlap and come together. And as Fran said, we started out with this idea that we had to apply certain models. And I felt like we were just doing a lot of saying no to people and telling them what they couldn't do. And it was awful. And so it has been a really great experience to break out of that and to learn, as Fran said, learn from all of you, all of the farmers that I've met with over the last few years. And I am I'm putting together a list of kind of creative farm projects. So I'm always collecting lists of things. So if anyone wants to email me their project and have it be in there, because one of the things that we can offer, I think, as lawyers is examples, and we can see, okay, this piece might fit for you, but this piece actually isn't going to work for you based on the facts and the local, the laws and everything, and the individuals involved. I guess Jean was wanting me to talk a little bit about the difference between a conservation land trust and a community land trust. So how many of you, I don't know if I can get a show of hands, but how many of you are familiar with conservation land trusts? Anybody? Okay. It's unfortunate that these two types of organizations share a name, because they are quite different. I mean, they do deal with land, but beyond that, it's pretty different. So conservation land trust, the tool that they have, one major tool, and that is a conservation easement. And when you have an easement on a piece of property, essentially what you have is that the nonprofit, the land trust owns the development rights on that land. So they don't own the land itself. It's still in private ownership, but they get to say, what can and can't be put onto this land. And that is for conservation purposes, for wildlife habitat, for mobility of different species, for, a variety of conservation and preservation values. Easements can work with farm land trusts, but I guess my big caution to people who choose to use easements on their farms is that easements are going to greatly restrict what you can do and where you can build put your buildings into the future. At the time of the easement, you have to select a building envelope, and then that's where you are going to be able to put things And also you're limited to as to what you can put, what types of buildings you can put on there. And community land trust, the land is owned, the nonprofit either buys it or gets it donated. They own that property and then they can put whatever they want on top of it. And typically their legal enforcement mechanism is a ground lease. So essentially, because they're the landlord, they can say this is going to be limited to farming and farm housing, things like that. But they don't need to have an easement in order to do that. And in order to sell, oh yeah, that's the other thing. Conservation easements don't allow, typically, not all of them, but what I've seen a lot of is they don't allow for you to have home ownership, separate home ownership on your farmland. They consider that a subdivision of the land, and that is not allowed under conservation easements. Meanwhile, that is like the primary tool for growing personal wealth that the community land trusts use. So, did I cover it, Jean? Was there anything else I was going to say about that?
No, I think that's helpful because we had maybe a third of the group had some familiarity, and so I think putting a finer point on it is helpful. And I'll just kind of tee us up for a couple of the questions that we've gotten so far.
Jean, before you do that, can I say one thing? Just because this point that Kristin's making was just a different way of framing it, which I found really helpful. So a lot of funders and others are all for conservation, right? They're all like, oh yes, we need to conserve this land. And the way that typically, especially white-led land trusts have done that is through this tool called the conservation easement. But the way that Kristin is talking about this is that actually a community land trust can conserve land by using a whole different tool, which is this tool of the ground lease. And the enforcement body behind it isn't this board of directors of a land trust that has nothing necessarily to do with the community, but it's rather a community enforced thing. Anyway, that's what I had to say. I'll be right back.
And that's actually a really good kind of segue into sharing a little bit of our insights as Agrarian Trust. We are really interested in how we advance community-led stewardship. And so we do think that a community that is close to the land, that's seeing what's happening with the land, that is right there, actually has a lot more to offer in ways that haven't been fully, valued, that have been in fact undervalued as far as the community's role, because we don't think we always need an outside entity to come and do our conservation standards for us. We think that we can build that capacity locally. And so we're excited to explore that sort of frontier in conservation. And I see in the chat, ground lease, is that the same as a condo agreement? Is there something similar there or the same? And Richie, if you'd like to elaborate on your question, we certainly welcome you to jump off mute and share a little bit of kind of the background on your question. But Fran, Kristin, maybe we could expand on the nature of a ground lease real quick before we move on.
Sure. Sorry, I was reading the chat. That was bad. A ground lease, what is a ground lease? It's like a hybrid between a landlord-tenant relationship and a homeowner. So you own the home, but you lease the land typically it's for 99 years and it's renewable. It depends on the state. In some states, you can't have the lease be that long. But the idea is sort of to mimic fee ownership of property, what we consider like real ownership of land. So the ground lease is the agreement, and somebody asked if it was like a condo association. Yes and no. I mean, no, I hope not. But it can get a little bit into the weeds. The ground lease is supposed to preserve the affordability over time. So there's this ongoing balance between allowing people to do what they want with their home, in their home, and also earn some money, and at the same time make sure that when that home is available for sale the next time to the next family, that it's available to people making the same, area median income, so low to moderate income families, and yeah, and just to make sure that they can pay their mortgage the same way the first family was able to pay their mortgage. And yeah, whereas HOA is more about sort of, well, it's about a lot of things, but it dictates more like what color your door can be and where you put your satellite dish and things like that. A ground lease is more about preserving affordability over the long term.
Just to add, because Kristin has taught me all of this, by the way. So the ground lease is, a lot of people have entered into a lease, right? Landlord tenant lease, you're leasing an apartment or a house or whatever, or land. And so the lease is for the land, the ground lease is for the land, but that is how the community land trust controls what can happen. So you as a homeowner, or you as a farmer who's building a house or a barn or whatever, you own the structure, and you essentially sell back. If you're leaving, you sell back, or you sell the structure. But how much, and Kristin, you said this, I'm just re-saying what you said. There's a limit on how much you can sell it for, and that's in the ground lease. And so the ground lease really is what allows the community that's located in the community land trust to say how things are going to go on this land, and how much the house can sell for, or what you're allowed, what kind of practices you can use on the land if that's what it's for. So just spelling out a little bit more what you were saying.
That was helpful. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you all. And any other questions on that before we jump back into the chat? We have some questions. So I think one that would be, yeah, any questions, any follow-ups?
I'm just seeing Rumbi's question, which seems like it's just a quick follow-up to this.
Okay.
I think that is a big difference here, Rumbi. I don't see funding for ground leases like there is funding for easements, because the funders, those who control the purse strings, have really just gotten into the conservation easement realm. And there's a lot of money from the federal government in easements through the Farm Bill, through this program called ACEP-ALE, which, don't ask me what that stands for, ACEP-ALE.
Yeah.
So a lot of conservation land trusts get funding through the US government, through ACEP-ALE. And so the conservation easement way of conserving land is much, much, much more funded in that way.
Right. There are beginning to be more resources available, including state and local resources for community land trust, but exactly right. The easements and typically the person who donates the easement, if you donate your easement, you get a tax rebate. So the landowner who donates the land, gets to take a certain amount off their taxes for 5 years. And if they sell it, then that's because, like Fran said, there's federal money to buy the easement and put that land into, taking away the development rights to it. So yeah, and it's tempting. I mean, so sometimes it makes sense to get a conservation easement on a piece of farmland if that is going to help you fund the project. I guess I would just caution that you make sure you know exactly what you're getting and what you're not getting when you do that. Yeah.
And so we put a couple of resources in the chat, and that's actually one of the things that Agrarian Trust is working on, is how do we educate philanthropy around the benefits of community-led stewardship? Because the traditional model has been, and sort of conventional, as Fran mentioned, has just been, it's been that they understand conservation easements, and that's where philanthropy, when they are interested in the work of regenerative agriculture, have been focusing in that arena. And so we're doing our absolute best to uplift the local community land stewards and the relationships and the people who are involved with protecting the land, and trying to really bring a certain, bring a certain respect for that. And so that has been, that's been a process. We're working on that. Every funder that we have a chance to talk with, we are emphasizing that role, because we think it's really important, because who is going to help rebuild soil and protect water and all of that, and restore land that's been degraded. A number of projects we're working with want to restore degraded land that has been, for example, just run roughshod over by, say, the CAFOs. We have a project in New Mexico where they're trying to restore former dairy CAFOs, essentially. And so it's not going to happen by itself. We're not going to just protect that land and everything is going to be fine. There's a serious restoration effort that needs to happen. And so we want to value that and be able to fund that work on the ground. And so we're doing our best. And so we can all, that's something we can all try to do, is work in more community-based stewardship into the grants we're writing and to how we're talking about all this work, conserving land, but also lifting up the stewards and paying them, funding that. So I want to jump into a couple of the other questions in the chat. That was a really great discussion. And so I saw a question that seemed relevant here too. Does a CLT have more ability to change over its lifetime than, say, I think that the answer is probably yes, vis-a-vis conservation easements. But that's probably how, well, I'm going to leave this to the experts to answer. So, Kristin, maybe a question for you. So, what
Well,
kind of
yeah,
flexibility does
so-
CLT have?
The CLT has its mission. They need to comply with their mission in order to stay on the good side of the IRS. And their missions can be broad or narrow, depending. Community land trusts can be used for not only home ownership, but also commercial spaces, historic preservation, open space, farmland, trying to think if I'm multifamily. They also get more and more people are using them under cooperatives as a backup for the co-ops. So putting a cooperatively owned multi-unit building on community land trust land, and then kind of supporting each other in that work. So you can always amend your bylaws to make them broader or narrower, but you have to, it has to be a nonprofit, and you have to stay true to this idea that, this is it's shared, not only shared equity, but it's the leadership of a community land trust is divided into three. So a third of the board, it needs to be homeowners or farmers or whoever, the beneficiaries of this land trust are. And then the other two portions can be either experts or local government folks, and then others like community members who are not actually living on the community land trust land, but who are supportive of the work that's being done. So yes, it's much easier with the issue. One of the biggest issues with the conservation land trust is that if there's federal money involved, you have to apply, first to the land trust that holds your easement, then that they apply, for a change to another body in the federal government, and so on. And I've watched that process take 3 years to finally get a no on. So yeah.
Thanks, Kristin. And Valentine, you had asked a question a little earlier. Do you feel like your question was kind of covered in that, or did you want to put a finer point?
Actually, I would love to follow up on that prior question too. So in the chat, I had asked about the difference between conservation easements being held by a land trust versus being like I was using the example here in Minneapolis, there are a number of community gardens that Trust for Public Land helped transfer the easements to the city council, like basically the city government holds the easements. And they're only 30 years, which appears to be a state limit. But I was really curious. So kind of part of the reason I was asking this is I was curious if maybe like municipal holding of easements might have more update capacity, or like, you know, like in the case where we're either through a CLT or a conservation land trust, because I know in this group, we've talked a lot about how do we shift toward having more housing be included in agricultural easements, particularly. Like it's not a subdivision of like we're replacing the farm, but it's like a subdivision where we're encouraging more farmers to live on a farm. And like, does that tend to be only updated at times when all the when the ground leases are turning over, or like where are the points in which change can happen? Because there are equity issues, and like, you know, this question of retaining affordability seems like the central focus of CLTs.
Yeah, the ground lease isn't impacted by that. It's the CLT itself has to make that decision about if they want to add more housing. That doesn't impact the existing homes and the homeowners' ground leases, if that makes sense. You know, they have their ground lease and it is what it is. It's like your rental agreement, or, you know, but you know, that's a really good question about the municipalities, and I have seen that done a couple of times. Typically, I see conservation easements being in perpetuity, so forever, but this may be a new thing where people are, you know, conservation easements are now getting to be 40 years old or 50 years old, and people are understanding perpetuity in a different way. Like, wow, that's a really long time. And, you know, things change in a way that we never anticipated. So that's, you know, so if there's a municipal conservation easement that lasts 30 years, it sounds like, yes, there would be an opportunity at the end of that term limit to revisit the idea. But for a community land trust, it's more, you know, they can be much more flexible in their development plans in that way. But then you're just dealing with density issues, you know, zoning laws, access to resources like water and sewer, things like that.
Right, that was exactly what I was thinking. Like in a ground lease, if you were going to subdivide and be like, now this was single family, now it's going to be 10 families or something. Would the land trust?
Land, I see.
Yeah, I mean, because I feel like that is the major shift that we are seeing people try to make, and also toward more responsiveness. I think kind of coming to the point Sachi made in the chat, like the level of status quo defense that white-led land trusts have been really off-putting to communities of color. And like actually the question of how does governance change? I'm curious if Land Access Alliance is like a place where people would be talking about this stuff. Like, where is the hub where people are talking about the changing culture of land trust?
You mean conservation land trust?
Or also CLTs, because like, yeah, I feel like CLTs themselves have shifted in being like less maybe paternalistic.
Right. They're in two different places. Grounded Solutions Network is the national network for community land trusts. There are also some very active regional CLT coalitions. There's a very active and successful one in Minnesota. If you're not aware of it, they're great. Minnesota CLT Coalition. And Land Trust Alliance, as far as I know, is really where the conversations around conservation land trusts, where those happen.
We're trying to infiltrate the Land Trust Alliance.
Right.
We're trying to impact on that conversation. But you know, it's like we're a little teeny piece in a very big boat.
There was a conservationists of color happy hour at the Land Trust Alliance last year. Portland, their annual meeting in Portland, and I think there were about 200 conservationists of color and in a population of about 2,000. So it was 10% roughly of the folks there. And that group is definitely having some very interesting conversations. If you want to check in with them.
Yeah, they're an ongoing group. They I think they're doing some strategic planning right now, but their plan is to continue to grow.
And that is a doubling from the Land Trust Alliance rally in Raleigh, North Carolina, the Agrarian Trust, that was our first time speaking there, maybe in 2018. And so whereas there were maybe that's even a tripling, because there were only about 50 or 60 people at the Conservationists of Color happy hour then. And people obviously invited guests and things like that who were not people of color. And so we were able to have, it was a multiracial event, of course. And so it's good to hear, 200 people is a lot more than 50 or 60 that we saw a few years ago. So definitely a group that's growing, and really, really great to see that's become a perennial effort. And I put a few links in the chat. So I see, Kristin, you have a question. Is there a group that you is that a group that people can reach out to when it comes to conservationists of color? Looks like
Yeah,
already got a link in the chat.
Okay,
Oh,
good.
great.
So yeah, definitely let's, a lot of great links in the chat, and we'll make sure that all of those get collected and get put together so that people can get those links and everything. And so I wanted to circle back to a couple questions. We have, I think, maybe 2 or 3 more questions, and boy, this hour is going fast. So I want to make sure we get back to a couple of these questions. So Eitan, you had a question around the Food Commons framework that was being developed. And is anyone familiar with Food Commons? I had not heard of their model, but there was a link in the chat around them. And so just wanted to lift up that question. It looks like they have an interesting model they were working on with multiple legal entities involved. And so, yeah, anyone familiar with them? So this was something that we're not sure if this is a project that is still in development or not, but here's what I found on their website that combined a nonprofit with a financing arm, a community-owned financial institution, and a cooperative integrated business. So that looks interesting for those who are kind of interested in that. And then Gary brings up the Detroit People's Food Commons as well. So any thoughts or questions around that? And Eitan, feel free to jump off mute if you wanted to elaborate on what might be of interest around that model for you. Because it doesn't sound like any of us are familiar.
Yeah, I was just trying to get confirmation about it. I know there was a brother working on it. A decade ago, and then like somebody put in the chat, Detroit has one as well. I was just trying to figure like, I guess you say,
It sounds like you're breaking up a little. Can folks hear? But I think as far as an active project, definitely thank you, Gary, for sharing the Detroit People's Food Co-op that has just opened. They just had their big grand opening. So that's one to watch for sure, as far as bringing in cooperative.
Jean, this question that Sachiko raises about, this is moving to a different topic. It says, my instinct is that restrictions on CLT models requiring nonprofit status are potential barriers, and are there alternatives? That's a really interesting question. And Kristin, I wonder if you've seen any CLTs that are not nonprofits. We have, I think that probably many of us are pretty familiar with the restrictions that gaining nonprofit status from the IRS puts on your activities. And I know, like, in the local project that I'm working on here, we just applied for C3 status, and we want to offer housing and in order to do a below market lease, we have to abide by the restrictions of what you can do as a nonprofit, which is basically have an income requirement. And the farmers that we're working with here were like, wait a minute, you know, one of the purposes of this is farm viability. We're actually trying to be not poor. So it really does come up against what you're trying to do. You're trying to get out of that, but the IRS is like, oh, no, 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 you can only offer this to poor folks. So anyway,
Yeah,
Kristin,
that's
I
a
wonder
good
if you've
point.
seen anything different.
Well, for one, just that reminded me before I forget that when you buy into a community land trust, when you buy a community land trust property, that's when you're you have to be income qualified. After that, you could win the lottery the next day. You will not lose your home. That is your home until you die or sell. So it's a model that is interested in promoting success, people's success. That's the whole point, is to help lift people up. Yes, there are definitely issues with CLTs for some communities of color. And in particular, I think it was on one of these calls that someone from Florida was telling me kind of about the situation in Florida and the way the CLTs had been put together really kind of from the top down. They were government started, and that there had been a lot of land that had been taken through eminent domain and other unfair practices by the government. And then that land was then being parceled out by these, you know, white-led government-led CLTs to people, you know, people in communities of color. So obviously super problematic. That said, there are a number of CLTs that are BIPOC-led that are doing great work. And anytime I talk to someone, work with a client who's wanting to put together a community land trust, I just emphasize that the community needs to be involved even before you pick a name, or, you know, I mean, you have to start community conversations about what it is that you're trying to achieve, and then recognize that the experts, the CLT experts in this case, are going to be the homeowners. They're going to be the ones who know what's needed and how it's needed. So, yeah, complicated, messy, and yeah.
And with that particular example, just thinking about how CLTs in really high dollar hot real estate markets function, because that was an example there where basically if you qualify for a CLT home, very unlikely that in Delray Beach, Florida, where that example is, there's nowhere to go. It's impossible to transition into market rate housing if you're someone who qualifies for only a CLT home in terms of meeting those affordability requirements. It's really the context that also adds a really difficult dimension to this. So if you're in a super expensive real estate market, CLTs are going to function in a way that often leads to people being stuck there. They're not going to be able to, you know, the CLT in terms of housing tip, you know, the average is that, what is it, Kristin, correct me if I'm wrong, it's somewhere between 60 and 70% of people transition to market rate housing within 5 to 7 years.
That was the statistic up until COVID. I am very concerned about what's happened since COVID, and Delray Beach is no longer unusual in that way. And I don't know what the stats are going to look like in the next 10 years, because the housing prices have become so divorced from what people are making in a local area. You know, the area median income doesn't carry the same weight. It's not connected to the housing prices. So, however, I mean, getting stuck in a CLT for some people is a great experience. I mean, not stuck, but you know, they can
Right.
be good experiences, especially if it's really a community-led CLT. But I do not talk about transitioning anymore as part of a CLT. I mean, right now, with the market as it is, it's really a challenge.
Absolutely. Thank you for speaking to that. And and that is a good note to, I'll rethink my language on that, because you know, it's definitely not that people are necessarily stuck if that's where they want to be, you know, and they've secured a nice home and they want to stay there, and the goal is that people can, you know, have stability in their housing and stay as long as they like. And so no need to actually transition if you found the community you want to be in. So that could be a wonderful thing. Again, as Kristin says, if it's a community-led process, that's where you're going to see that kind of benefit. And so we have a question that came in by email that I want to touch on. And so a group that is looking to create a you know, is now, they're holding land fee simple with sole ownership in 2 people, and they want to transition to having a local group oversee the stewarding of the community, which includes land and homes. And they're interested, they have a C3, but they could also transition to being an advisory board. And so they're sort of interested in working with another nonprofit to handle the technical and administrative work that they sense that they don't have enough capacity to deal with. And I think that that's the most common thing that we see at Agrarian Trust, is that groups are really excited to work together, to hold land collectively, to do farming activities, and not so keen on managing the back end and all the administrative and legal work. And so on that note, I did want to lift up this other event that I mentioned that's happening later today. There's a group called the Nonprofit Financial Commons, and they are hosting an event called Fiscal Sponsorship to be a C3 or not to be. And that's 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern. And they have their registration link there. Our whole team's going from Agrarian Trust, because we're really exploring this as an option for different groups that might want to either work with us through a fiscal sponsorship agreement, or work with another land trust through this type of arrangement. So we think that may also be a relevant option for folks. And so I wanted to lift up that opportunity. But back to that question. So a group writes in that they're looking for the best formation for having a local group that oversees stewarding land on the ground, and how they can get support on the technical administrative work that they feel that they don't have the ability to sustain. So some different options there. And does fiscal sponsorship sounds like something that would come to mind for a group that's in that situation? Just hearing the overview. Kristin, Fran, any thoughts on that? And just on fiscal sponsorship in general.
Tentatively, yes. I would want to know more about what the local group, whether it's been created and how far they've gone. And again, kind of going back to the comments that I made at the beginning, like, I totally understand the desire of the owners to create this. And the question for me is, how far has it gone? And is there a local group involved already? And what does the local group want to do? I think I've been involved in a lot of fiscal sponsor arrangements, both on both sides. It is not an easy thing to be a fiscally sponsored group, because the fiscal sponsor has control. The fiction that the IRS has in order to make this work is that the fiscally sponsored group is a project of the fiscal sponsor. So the fiscal sponsor agreement has to include language that basically gives control of the project to the fiscal sponsor. So as with everything that we do, it's all about relationship. And if you have a good relationship and have built trust with both groups, then there is possibility of that working well. But without that, I would not do a fiscal sponsorship, because I have been involved in bad fiscal sponsor arrangements where I was being fiscally sponsored and the fiscal sponsor did some things that were really bad for us as a group. So I'm wary. But it also, you know, if you're a group that's starting out, or you're not making more than a couple $100,000 in revenue a year, and it's worth it to get the back end stuff done for you because you don't have capacity and somebody else can do the accounting and the financial and any HR and that kind of thing, it can be worth it for sure. It depends. That's a lawyer's answer to everything. It depends.
Well, thank you, Fran. That's important that we hear that. And I will also just add that Agrarian Trust, you know, when we got started a little over 10 years ago, we were fiscally sponsored, like a lot of nonprofits are when they first get their start. And so I definitely think of it as kind of its training wheels for nonprofits. And so if you're not sure, you know, exactly what you want to do, but you do have a group that's organized and you want to accept donations or do, you know, get grants, and you're able to form a good relationship with another nonprofit that can let you kind of, you know, take some of the burden off you for having like full-time staff to manage your administrative work. You know, there's typically a fiscal agency fee, and that covers, you know, the work of that nonprofit, but it allows you to kind of have some flexibility when you're getting started. So yeah, definitely depends. Absolutely what Fran said. And so we were lucky to be working with social and environmental entrepreneurs was our first fiscal sponsor. And then we transitioned to having Schumacher Center for New Economics be our second. And they really helped us incubate and grow because luckily they really wanted to see us thrive. And so they were really supportive, but we already had that relationship. It was really warm and caring and trusting relationship. And so that's why it worked well for us. But I think that if you don't have that already, those risks are really important for people to consider, as Fran said. Anything you wanted to add to that, Kristin?
No, just that, right. I think of fiscal sponsorships working best in a temporary situation where you know you want to, you know, develop into your own organization or join another organization, but you're not in a position like suddenly somebody wants to give you money or, you know, donate property or something, then a fiscal sponsorship can be a good sort of half measure. But the quick thing I wanted to say, Fran, about can CLTs be for profit? I mean, I think by definition, no, because the community ownership of land that gets done through a nonprofit, but certainly individuals who want to do this can do that. If you own land and you want to, you know, work on sort of equity sharing models on your own land, I think you can do that. Also, cooperatives are for-profit organizations, but they, the difference between co-ops and like a C Corp is that your goal or your whatever, it doesn't have to be highest and best use. You know, it's not all about financial gain. The focus of a co-op is to provide benefit to the membership. So, and there is a limit on, I think, how much you can make as a co-op, like how much profit a year. It's like 6 or 7%, depends on the state. But I think that's an excellent in-between model. And I mean, you see things like the REI co-op. I mean, they can get big and very, very successful. So.
Yeah, that's a great addition. And there are already so many wonderful resources online and groups working at that intersection of co-ops and business. And so we would be, you know, we're not the experts on that. There's just so much more that folks can find, and I can pull together a couple resources to add in the chat if people are interested in that. But I think a key question is, are you looking to have a charitable purpose and receive grants and donations? And if the answer is yes to that, you really have to keep nonprofits on the table as part of your, you know, suite of options. And the thing is, you can have multiple entities be part of sort of your process. And I almost think of, because there isn't one perfect legal model, as we've emphasized, there's no one size fits all for every community. Considering multiple options and having an LLC, having a cooperative, having a nonprofit arm, it's looking like you have to have a palette to really paint the picture of community equity building and land tenure. It's not going to be one thing. Any other questions or thoughts? I think that those are all the questions that I was able to gather from the chat, and Katie, any that I missed that you saw, or anything that folks want to pop back up for us to look at? Oh, I
Stephen's
saw
had his hand up,
Catherine had a question too.
And I
Um,
see a hand raised as well.
Stephen, please share, and then we'll tee up. Catherine had some comments and a longer question that we want to tee up.
Sure,
You know,
just super briefly, I just want to kind of emphasize what you were also just saying, which is you can have any kind of an entity you want and act altruistically. You know, there's no legal requirement that a for-profit business be cutthroat. I mean, you know, just think about every farm you've ever been to. I mean, they're almost every single one technically, you know, a for-profit business. You can do anything you want to, but the way that people get driven into nonprofit status once they organize is if they want any kind of a grant. I mean, it's just essentially a uniform requirement from foundations that the entity receiving the money be officially a nonprofit. So yeah, I mean, we operate in this world where there's just a habit with people with money and who they want to give it to, and we have to work within that.
A habit and tax exemption.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's highly incentivized.
yeah, well said. Thank you so much, Stephen, for emphasizing that. Something to remember, that there's nothing in the legal structure of a corporation that says it has to act cutthroat. I like that quote. So you can be altruistic or you know, responsible to your community in any type of entity you want to form. There's a lot of choice there. So really well said. Thank you. And we did have a question from Catherine in the chat looking at agrivoltaics and timeframes for long-term leases. And so I want to go back to that question. So I'm just going to read it out, and Catherine, feel free to jump in. Or if you'd like to just jump in and elaborate a little bit and just ask your question directly, that'd be great.
Sure, I'll just do it directly. I'm thinking about revenue streams, as you know, besides philanthropy and other things. And we see solar is going to be going out over the next 2 decades all over farmland. And it's going to be going onto land that is private as well as public. And, you know, if you have agrivoltaics and, you know, and other things, then we're talking about agreements for electricity sale that are 25 years at least with warranties. So we have this time period from the technology and the land underneath. So I am wondering about, you know, thinking about as, so I work with solar commons, and the framing of Sunshine is that so that people can access that as a revenue stream. So a revenue stream for farmers, and combining some kind of ownership strategy for 25 years under agrivoltaics that where farmers could access that land, and in long-term agreements. And then, you know, combining that idea of soil building and care and the, you know, equitable distribution of revenue streams or financial benefits from solar being for, you know, for low income and farming communities, combining that. So is this group, or does anybody know about those kind of legal strategies that are coming out of that potential? That's a kind of socio-cultural technology potential.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that real quick. What I'm seeing is a lot of CLTs, and particularly the ones, you know, that have farmland, are interested in those different revenue streams, and also including wind and, like you said, soil, making soil better. I can't think of the word. Anyway, carbon sequestration. The issue that I'm seeing, like on a very practical level, is getting loans for individuals to buy into the solar project. Or, you know, housing is how we understand wealth building in this country, and banks and other lenders, that's what they do for individuals. Other kinds of loans, unsecured loans, as they call them, are, they're considered riskier. They charge higher rates, and often it's just harder to, impossible to get them. And especially if it's going to be like a collective ownership of something like, a bunch of solar panels. I think we're going to get there. I do, but I just don't think we're there yet. There's a lot of work happening in the economic development space on that. Sorry, go ahead, Jean. You looked like you had something to say.
Well, I wasn't gonna add anything, but
Okay.
anyone else wanted to jump in, feel free. Gary, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I just want to add to what she was just saying, as far as that pivot and transition for those investments and loans. I know, for instance, here in the Twin Cities, Shared Capital is put forth in looking at funding for co-ops around climate lending. So particular potentially solar, agrivoltaics, and different things of that nature. And so that's something that's in the works that's coming down. I don't know if they actually got the funding, but there is funding out there for CDFIs in particular to get involved. And I think that's either through the EPA or the IRA funding. I would have to double check on that, but those are some of the things that are happening out there, just to add some insight to what she was speaking on.
So Gary, I want to just add the green banks that have just kind of come out. Maybe that's what also you're referring to through the IRA, right?
Yes.
Right. So the green banks, and we're Nevada just got a huge loan from a green banks. And I know the Solar Commons project, we're going to try to test whether a Solar Commons agreement, to own this solar could go and be security at a green bank. And that means that then the group could get because the solar will immediately start paying itself back. And yet after 4 years, when that's been paid, the revenue stream comes back to then the owner. So green banks are starting to be funded and get upstart funding now through green banks. And that's a real important kind of revenue stream, I think, here.
That's great. Thank you both for sharing that.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear about. And so Stephen actually had a note in the chat. Did you want to lift that up, Stephen, or elaborate a little more at all? So just looking at understanding agreements that are signed regarding solar and everything else. Lawyers write the agreements, goodwill by the organization does not mean that the contracts are not one-sided. So yeah, thank you for offering that insight.
Stephen, you want to say anything more about that?
We've all had experience with angel investors and others that, it just because somebody even intends good, once you start doing written agreements, it seems to pop up that they protect themselves from risk. So if you're presented with a contract, it's just extremely important to read it and understand it. And I would add that in agriculture, we have a very long tradition, in poultry and other areas, of extremely one-sided contracts. I don't mean to be a, Debbie Downer here, but, the newest wave of them are carbon contracts, which Flag just wrote a guide to, and they are just really one-sided is the extremely polite way to put it. So just be careful. And, if you're ever on the side of the equation where you're trying to sign people up, like, read the contract that you're selling, and think about whether you'd want your own family to sign it. So sorry to intrude with bad thoughts.
No, thank you so much. And Stephen, that I worked at RAFI, Rural Advancement Foundation International, for 5 years, and was such a huge fan of the work that you all have done at Flag, and just helping us share those resources with farmers who are, promised the moon when it comes to some of the companies that are offering them opportunities. And so I just thought on this note of the agrivoltaics, RAFI, Rural Advancement Foundation International, just published a blog called Harvesting the Sun. And a friend of mine, Kavita Kopa, wrote this post and that just was published last month. And it's a short film produced by NCAT, National Center for Appropriate Technology, looking at solar companies and farmers working together. So that might be something for those who are interested to get a little deeper dive. Looks like there's a short film and a blog post with some thoughts. And there's also the Agri Solar Clearinghouse. Apparently that all these resources that I didn't even know about. So thank you for bringing that up, Catherine. And yeah. So maybe we'll just kind of do some closing remarks. Fran, Kristin, anything you want to send us off with? And of course, Katie and Gary, if you'd like to, and Valentine, if you'd like to share anything from the group about our next session.
I'll just say, these conversations are so helpful. Although the lawyers come in as if they're the experts. I said this already, but I'm going to say it again. There's some things that we know, obviously, but there's a lot of things that we don't know, and we can't do our work without y'all's expertise and understandings and questions, and you push the envelope, and that's really, really helpful. So thank you for your participation in this, and really always happy to be here with you all.
Yes, I learned some new things today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fran, Kristin, Jean, and everyone. I will go ahead and mention that our next session is going to be June 25th. It's a Tuesday again, as usual, same time. Watch for more information on that. Luis Marcos will be joining us. Jean, can you remind me the name of the organization that he's with?
Oh, with Maya Economic Development Corporation. So a multiracial and multi-ethnic indigenous-led collective that Agrarian Trust is really lucky to be collaborating with in Nebraska in the Omaha area. So Luis is the president of that organization, and he'll be coming to speak about not only working with Agrarian Trust, but really being informed by the Native Nations Rebuilding Framework. And so bringing to light some of the indigenous-led collective land ownership practices that Agrarian Trust is also learning from and embracing as we kind of move forward. So we're really excited to have Luis.
Great, thanks, Jean. Yeah, really exciting opportunity. We'll look forward to seeing you all there. And thanks so much for being in community with us today. And thanks again to Fran and Kristin for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good week.
You
Bye.
too. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.